Now we're going to take a look at using some of the existing fire presets that we made and applying them to different types of objects in order to create different types of fire effects. I'm going to start out by loading in a different atmosphere, and we're just going to go to that Others and select Black Back. I'm going to delete our ground plane and also our sunlight. And this way we'll be able to see the effects a lot better, and it'll just look really good in contrast with the black background. Now the first effect I want to show you is just having fire sort of sprawl out across the ground. I'm going to do this by using a cylinder, and actually a couple. So I'm going to start out just by adding our one cylinder, and just move this down. And then we're going to click into our rotate mode, and I'm going to hold down Shift so that we snap to 90 degrees. And then I want to stretch this out. And we're actually going to be animating this a little more squished on the x-axis, but I just want to start out with something a little bit larger, because when we convert this to a metablob, you'll be able to see the rounding on the edges. And if we stretch it out too much, then that rounding is really not going to look right. It's going to alter our fire. So now I just want to copy and paste this current cylinder that we have, and I am going to size this down. And actually we could just go ahead and stretch this out on the z-axis first and then scale it. And then we're just going to stretch it back on our x-axis. And we just want to create a sort of an egg shape if we look at it from more of the profile. And I can squish that in just a little bit more. And that should be good. So we can select both of our cylinders, go to the left, make it into a metablob. And now this is the object we're going to be using to create this effect. And instead of using this as a metablob, I'm going to right mouse click and select Bake to Polygons. I'm going to bake about 14,000 polygons, which should be more than enough to keep the shape of this without it looking polygonal. And then we can just start out by loading in one of those fire effects. And I'm going to start out by loading in our one with the blue bottom. And now we can see that showing up. And it seems to work well with this object. If we look at it from the side, we can tell we're going to need to alter a few things just so it fills in more of the overall surface area. But let's take a look at our material, because we do need to change one major thing. So if we double click to open up our advanced material editor, currently we have this set to object standard mode for our mapping. And we want to change this to world standard. And that's because we want to keep our flames in the same place, but to just expand upon the area in which we're showing our overall surface. So if we take a look, the basic overall size and shape is still pretty much the same, so we don't have to worry about making any modifications to the actual surface itself. And the effect I want to create is just having our flames start from one end and then expand on as if they were spreading across the ground. So what we need to do is start out with more of a squished object. And first I'm just going to hit F11 on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up our timeline. And also we have our properties open as well, and it started rendering a preview because I had that open from before. So I'm just going to close out our preview and also hide those properties for right now, because we're not going to be animating the surface or the actual material, just the object itself. And since this is controlled by the velocity of material origin, we can take a look under lighting and effects, and we can still see we have those values saved from the earlier sections of the tutorial. Just click OK. And now what I want to do is just squish this object for our starting point. And now we're only displaying just a small section of what we were showing before. The more we expand this, we're just going to basically expand upon the overall amount of the surface we're seeing. Now, because this is a volumetric material, and once we have it very small, we can take a look, and the flames look much better, but that's because there's a lot more volume overall with the edges, so it does look a little bit different. So we're going to have to make a few modifications and possibly change a couple of material attributes to have them animated, but not a very drastic animated effect. It's just going to be very simple because overall this effect is actually quite easy. So if we can just squish this for our starting point, you can see it's very bright, not a lot of spaces in between. So we're going to need to change that once we get to later in the animation. So now we need to decide how long we want our animation to be. And typically fire spreads very quickly, at least with this kind of an effect. But we do want to just slow it down a little bit so we can see a little bit more of what's going on. So I'm going to bring this to 2 seconds, which will actually be pretty long, very slow shutter speed for filming, very high frame rate. If we were to actually do this in real life and film flames, we'd probably have to record this at around maybe 200 to 300 frames per second. And then once that's played back, it would give the appearance of slow motion. So now that we have our slider at 2 seconds, I'm going to stretch this out on the x-axis. And now we can see a lot more of our material. And I also want to adjust our position, because instead of having it spreading out in both directions, I want to have more of a specific placement, as if it was just going from the left side of the screen to the right. So we're going to go back to frame 0 and just take a look at where our starting point is and where our end is right now. Go to the end of the animation, and we can just move our object to kind of fit that into place. And that way, if we scrub through the animation, it just looks more like it's expanding. Now we could also adjust our pivot point to have it on the end, and that way when we stretch it, it'll basically do the same effect without us having to create a position key point. But this method also works. So we're just going to stick with this right now, since it's not a very complex animation, and a little bit of position change is not really going to be a huge deal. Now what I also want to do to start to fill in that volume is to stretch it on another direction. And in this case, we're going to be doing it on the y-axis. So as we start reaching towards the end of the animation, and it starts spreading out, we just wanted to expand on that y-axis, and now we can see a lot more filled in, and it starts to match up with more at the beginning of the animation, where we can see a lot more flames and more of a dense overall fire. And we start scrubbing through, and we can just see our flames expanding. And because we're in that world mode and not object mode, our overall flames are staying in the exact same position. It's just how much of them we're showing. Now we also need to adjust some of the fuzziness and luminosity settings of our material over time, just so that it stays a little more consistent. And I do like the overall density of this at the starting frame. So I'm going to jump to our last frame. And actually, I'm going to reposition our camera first, just so we can see that a little bit better. And we just want to do this at frame 0, so we're not creating any camera motion. We're going to go all the way to our last frame, double-click to open up our advanced material editor. And now we can start adjusting some of these settings in order to really fill in this overall volume. One of the first things I think we should do is just pull down the fuzziness value. And now it's going to ask us if we want our material to become animated. And we're going to click yes, because we do. And now we can see that is filling in a little bit more. Looks a little bit better. But it might be a little bit overexposed, so we can bring that fuzziness value back up just a little bit more. and take a look at it. Click OK, go back to frame 1, and take a look at the overall luminosity and just how bright it is on certain areas of the flame, and then just watch it over time to make sure everything is staying fairly consistent. And it looks like it is overall. And we also have to keep in mind that looking at this from different angles, because it is a volume, it is going to change the overall appearance. So if we look at this from more of the top, going back to frame 1 to create our initial frame, we can see it's very bright, and once we start to expand this outward, we see a lot more of the blue flames than we do of our yellow flames. And that's because this material is really set up to be viewed from the sides. If we were going to be viewing this from the top, we would have to make a couple of modifications in order for it to look correct, just because there is more volume on the bottom than there is on the top. So if we go back to frame 0, take a look at this more from the side, with just a little bit of an angle. And now we can expand upon that. And that looks fairly realistic. So let's just create a very quick preview on the bottom so that we can see this a little bit better. So I'm just going to open up our preview, and we're going to right mouse click on this little film, and that way we can get our advanced preview options. Now currently this is going to be 12 frames per second for our preview, so we're going to be skipping frames. And actually I just want to verify that our actual animation is going to be 24 frames per second. So I'm going to cancel this, go up to Animation, Advanced Render Animation, or Animation Render Options. And we can see that 24 frames per second is selected. Now if we were to change that to another set of frames, it would basically just change our keys, and everything would still match up correctly. So we don't have to worry about losing any information if we change the keyframes. So let's go back to our preview options, and I'm actually going to view this with all of the frames. So we're going to do 24 frames per second, and that way we can see the entire animation. I also have our preview size set at 4 so we can see it a little bit better, and I'm just going to go ahead and render this out with a final render quality. So now we can take a look at the preview and just kind of scrub through, and we can see our flames expanding and creating a nice little wall of fire. And if you pay attention, you can see, especially if you look right here where this main flame is, you can tell it's staying in the same place, and that we're just expanding upon how much of the overall surface we are seeing, which is one of the really nice things about the world mapping mode. Now one of the only problems is it looks like the texture isn't really quite moving fast enough with the overall flames. So we might need to make some changes, maybe to rotation and twist, and animate that over time so it matches up. And let's just take a look at a larger render to really see what the effect is going to look like. So I'm going to go to our render options. I'm going to change this to broadcast. And that way we have motion blurring on. You can see that become checked once broadcast is turned on. I'm just going to render this to screen and choose 640 by 480. Actually, we'll go up to 800 by 600 and make it a little bit larger. And then we can just click OK and render that out. And now we can see the finished frame. And overall, it doesn't look too bad. And we might need to adjust our density along the bottom just so we can fill that up a little bit more. And one of the easiest ways we can do that is just the same way we created the blue color on the bottom, except instead of working with color, we'll be working with density, and we can connect that to the slope as well. So that way on the bottom, we could have a little more dense, or we could even connect the fuzziness directly to density within the function editor. And that way we could have it fuzzier on top, a lot more than it is on the bottom, and that will create a much more realistic looking effect. Plus, a lot of it has to do with the exact angle that you're viewing it from. So there's a lot of things that come into play when you're making fire, and especially when you're animating and creating special effects with them. And you'll be able to find a fully rendered version of this both on the website and in the content folder. But let's take a look now at another way we could animate this fire. And this time let's have more of a circular effect where we have expanding from the center outward. And that'll be pretty neat looking, so we can go back to frame 1, delete this metablob object, or this baked metablob. I also want to delete any keys we have, and we can just still work in the same scene. We don't need to create a new one. I'm going to start out by just adding in a sphere, and this will work quite well for this effect. And we can see the material already added to this sphere, and the fire actually doesn't look too bad on it, although it does look like we need maybe another object on the bottom. So let's go ahead and copy that and paste it, move the sphere down, and we're going to squish it on the z-axis, and then we're going to create an overall scale, and then we're going to select our first sphere and just squish that down a little. And then we can select both of those spheres, create a metablob out of them, and then we can freeze that metablob or bake it to polygons. About 17,000 frames or polygons, and overall that is a fairly large amount, but it'll definitely be enough, and it won't slow down the overall response of the program. Now we need to double check our surface, so we're going to double click, go to the Advanced Material Editor, and we can see our mapping mode is set to world as it was before with the previous example, so we don't need to make any changes there. And all we really need to do now is just animate. So I'm just going to squish this down a little bit more on the Z, and we can scale this in. Actually pull that back up. And I'm going to create another 2-second animation. And now at 2 seconds, I'm just going to scale this upward. And we're scaling the entire object right now. And once we get to that point, I'm going to squish it down on our z-axis. And we're going to go back to our first frame and readjust our camera. And if we scroll through the animation, we can see a really nice circular effect of what we had before, where our fire is just expanding overall. And now the blue is very bright in this case. And what I'm going to do is just load in one of our other fire examples. And I'm going to use the one without the blue effect. So we're just going to focus on yellow flames. We want to make sure we go into the material and select World Standard. So we can just swap those out with no problems. And we have this key right here. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that, because we don't want any outside key interference. Go to our last frame. And mainly, if we expand our properties, we can see our fire is animated with that material. So we're going to delete our keyframes for that. Go back to frame 0. And I'm just going to reset our size keyframe at 2 seconds, scale this up. A little bit too large. And also one of the nice things about volumetrics is we can go into the objects and see them entirely in their 3D space. So we could easily fly into this fire. I'm going to go back to frame 0 reposition our camera so we're looking a little more down on our object and our animation. And now we can see the overall effect. And if we need to, we can change our size of our material, maybe a little bit larger. So go back to frame 0. I'm going to bring this up to 1.4. We just want something that matches up a little bit better with our current size. And then I'm going to add just a little bit of material animation to this. So I'm going to double click to open up our advanced material editor, making sure we double click on our preview. And let's change our turbulence first. We're going to adjust our scale, make sure we click yes, we'd like to animate it. Increase our harmonics and our amplitude just a small amount, and close that. And we also want to edit our rotation for this object. We can twist it a little, and we can rotate it a little bit more. A tiny amount on the X and the Y, mainly on the Z. Close that out, click OK. Now it looks like our turbulence node might be a little too high for this because we're seeing a lot of waves and that overall water effect. So we're going to go back into our material and under turbulence, turn down our amplitude so it's not affecting it entirely as much as it is. And we just want a slight change on these settings. And we take a look. Looks like our twist settings might be a little too high, so we can bring those in a little bit more. And still changing them enough. And most of our animations based on our velocity of material origin and our rotation that we have. So we can click OK. And now let's render out a quick preview. Do final, 24 frames per second, and at 4 times so we can see it a little bit larger. And now we can scrub through our preview, and one thing you will notice is that our flames are traveling very quickly as this spreads out, almost as if there's wind blowing kind of along our x-axis. And a lot of that has to do with our velocity of material origin being set to values other than just our z. So this is an easy way to sort of recreate wind blowing our flames in specific directions. And overall it looks pretty neat. So if we need to, we can modify that velocity. If we double click and take a look at our material, we can see that velocity right there. And also part of our rotation might be contributing to that overall look along with the turbulence. So it's something you need to kind of play around with until you get the correct effect. And since a lot of it really depends on the overall size of your image and the size of your object, there are some settings that will need to be tweaked and fine-tuned. Now one thing we notice is there's really not a lot of density around the outside of our object. And one way we could take care of that is if we were to create a meta blob, and I'll just go to our last frame and we'll take a look. Now if we were working with this sort of a shape, we could add a torus and fit it in on the outside of our object, making sure we do this before we create our meta blob. And that would create more of a lip around the edges, which will end up increasing our overall density and give us a much more realistic looking effect. And I also want to load in just another atmosphere so we can take a look at the overall lighting of this if we're using it in a scene that's not just black. Go to Spectral Sunshine. I'm going to load in our default sky. Go to our atmosphere editor and change our pitch to more of the center of the slider, and that way our sun will be higher up in the atmosphere. And we can scrub through and take a look at our overall. And we can tell that it might be a little too bright in some of these areas if we're working with a full sunlight scene. So we can just decrease our luminosity, or our luminous value. And also, if we go back to frame 0 and take a look at our material, we just want to make sure our span is increased to 100% and our intensity down to 0. And that way our sun will not influence the overall luminosity value. And we can scrub through to the end, take a look at our preview. Still see it's very bright, because really our flare settings, since we're basically only working with a luminous based object, it's not going to affect it too much. So let's go back. We can adjust our luminous to 200. Click OK. If we go to our last frame, set that to 200 as well, because we are currently working with an animated surface, so it is going to just adjust from that 200 to 300. And now we can see it looks a little bit better. The overall size might need to be changed, but if we take a look at some of the lower frames, where we're seeing a more dense flame overall, it looks pretty good, and doesn't look like we really need to change anything. And then you can take a look at a final render of this, which will be found both on the website and also within the content folder.